Hello everyone, this is Mukesh Gupta here. You're listening to Pushing Beyond the Obvious. Today we have with us Scott. Scott, can I ask you to introduce yourself and probably the body of work that you have done so far so our audience can actually relate to whatever we speak after that?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Mukesh. So my name is Scott Hartley. I'm the author of a forthcoming book. It's called The Fuzzy and the Techie. My background is sort of as a fuzzy in the tech world, if you will. I graduated with a degree in political science and political theory in international relations, and then I found my way kind of into Silicon Valley. I had the fortune of being from Northern California and kind of the heart of Silicon Valley, and so I took an HTML course in high school, and then I became an HTML editor at a failed startup in the late '90s. I didn't have the foresight of joining a company like Google quite early enough, but I did join them later and spent a year with them in India and did some work with Google.org in Africa. But always, all along, was sort of somebody that appreciated the analog kind of world and the physical world, and then spent a bunch of time working at tech companies. And so, really, the book that I have coming out explores this sort of duality and sort of faux opposition between the two, and how, in fact, there are many people at the heart of technology that come from these various walks of life, and actually they provide much needed perspective and sort of application of the technology and how we humanize the technology, how we apply it to some of the big, meaningful problems in our lives. And really, I got the sort of impetus to write the book, spending the last 5 or so years in venture capital. And so basically working with two different firms, one in New York and one on Sand Hill Road in California, where my job was to meet with early stage entrepreneurs at sort of the seed, Series A, Series B level, and evaluate the team, the market, the technology, where we thought the world was going, and then make investment decisions around that. And one of the observations that I had was that so many of the really exciting companies we were meeting with were people that were, for sure, we had people coming from IIT and from MIT and all the, fancy technical schools, Tsinghua University in China. But we also had people coming from, various walks of life where they really understood fashion, they really understood finance or media or, industrial materials or any number of domains. And then they were partnered with the technologists to apply the tech to that problem. And so it kind of opened up this lens in my mind where I said, wait a minute, this whole narrative about tech being this monolith where everybody studies computer science and drops out of middle school, this is not, it's not necessarily true. And, certainly there are a lot of those people building the tech infrastructure and laying down the groundwork. But I think as we get to the sort of application layer of technology, there are more and more of these opportunities for anyone from any different background to sort of take the tech, assemble the pieces, and then apply it to what they know.
Interesting. So I came to know about your work through one of my contacts called Paul Kurchina. He introduced me to your blog, and I started following your blog. And when your publicist actually reached out to me, asking if you would be a good fit for this show, I was pleasantly surprised. And she was kind enough to send me a copy of your book, and I read through almost most of your book. I think just 20 more pages to go. And I must say that the book is a fascinating read, not just from a content perspective, but also the way you have written the book and the kind of examples that you talk about in this book. But before we even go there, I mean, you talk about the fuzzy and the techie. So for people to understand, what do you mean by a fuzzy and what do you mean by a techie?
Yeah, of course. So these are terms that I sort of commandeered that were used on Stanford University campus. So the fuzzy and the techie were ways of referring to what people studied on campus. And this goes back to the 1960s, 1970s. So it's not a new term on campus, but it's one that's sort of fun that I wanted to use to kind of explain this duality. But really, the fuzzy on campus referred to somebody who studied the arts, the humanities, or the social sciences. So including things like economics, commerce, things like that. The techie, was somebody who studied sort of hardcore engineering or some of the technical sciences or computer science. And really, even though this question exists, it's sort of this faux opposition, this sort of false assumption that you're one or the other. Because if you actually peel back the onion and you take a look at somebody who's working on an engineering problem, in a lot of times that requires customer research, that requires sort of anthropological research to figure out what people want, what they need. So then is engineering a soft subject? Well, it has elements of that, and then you look at security studies or international relations, and so much of it has to do with figuring out probabilistically when something's going to happen. So there's elements of game theory, there are elements of statistical rigor. And so, then is political science a technical subject? And so you kind of get into this gray area where you realize, okay, no one is truly a fuzzy or truly a techie. We're all a bit of both. And actually a lot of, where innovation in here is in this sort of intersection between the two.
Interesting. And the idea that we have these fuzzies and the techies, and when they come together is when innovation happens, is very similar to the old philosophy, both Chinese Buddhist philosophy of yin yang and Indian philosophy as well, where it is all about having a balance of different things. And when I read your book, that's what was striking to me, that like thousands of years before, people did refer to these facts, and then we are rediscovering some of these as we go along. Yeah. Did that strike to you as well when you were writing this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that looking inside, again, kind of back to the perch of Sand Hill Road and meeting all these founders, the realization that there was this sort of duality or kind of two people coming together, providing, really it's about where you can have a creative skill sets. So if you're really good at the technical side, you probably really need to find a co-founder or somebody early in the technology company, early in your company, who can really supplement sort of market development, maybe, understanding the domain deeply. So if you're starting an insurance company, you might be the technical wizard, but you probably need somebody who comes out of 30 years of experience in the insurance industry, who really understands the problems, really knows where the heart attacks are, not just the headaches. Because, if you're trying to build a, multi-million-dollar business, unicorn business, and, is what we call in Silicon Valley, these take a real understanding of where those pain points are that are massive, where there's willingness to pay. And oftentimes that takes the insight of somebody who's spent a lot of years in the industry. So, while I appreciate sort of the first principles approach of thinking things from the ground up, I also appreciate the approach of involving people that have spent a lot of time in the industry, questioning them, asking, where you can learn from those experiences. And so I do think that this sort of yin and the yang and, this sort of balance of both sides is really helpful. And you see that, at a lot of successful companies. If you look at Mark Zuckerberg, people often think, okay, he's just this lightning fast coder that, dropped out of Harvard and built Facebook because he was a technical genius. While to be sure, he had, ability to create the basic prototype and the MVP, minimum viable product and those sorts of things. He also had to build a whole team around him. So it was really the conviction that he had to get people like Sheryl Sandberg, who gave up almost a C-suite position at Google, high VP, probably on the cusp of getting to run, a significant portion of Alphabet down the road, and convincing her to leave and join this startup with, some promise, but in 2007, it was far less writing on the wall, or far less understood that it was going to be the company that it is today.
True. And you also talk about this phenomenon in multiple startups, not just Facebook. You also talk about, people that Google hired in order to be able to, bring in the humanities side. There was a philosopher in residence at Google. And, this is something that normally is never spoken about in the public medium. And it is always that, these technical wizards who, just by the sheer technical brilliance are able to bring out these products, which then go on to become multi-million-dollar or multi-billion-dollar industries at some point in time.
Yeah, it's true. And there's obviously truth to that as well. And so it's not sort of a one side or the other side. It's that, both of these sides are really valuable. And, you look at Apple, for example. Obviously, Steve Wozniak was a technical genius behind, apparently, he wrote thousands and millions of lines of code, and people said he had almost no errors in his code. So obviously, he was incredibly good at what he did. But then you look at Steve Jobs, obviously bringing calligraphy, bringing sort of an appreciation of liberal arts from Reed College, where he dropped out, to create a graphical user interface, to create sort of the WYSIWYG interface of multiple type fonts and folder systems, and sort of the intuitive structuring of the desktop computer. And so, that's obviously a strong example. And if you look at what Apple's done to preserve the legacy of Steve Jobs, they actually brought in the former dean of the Yale School of Management to run something they called Apple University. And somebody who's been, helpful and kind of a mentor to me is a moral philosopher, this guy named Josh Cohen. And Josh studied under John Rawls at Harvard, brilliant, political thinker of the day, kind of moral philosopher. And Josh gave up a 10-year position at Stanford University where he taught law and ethics and political science, and he gave all that up to go work at Apple as sort of an in-house philosopher. And and he was delivering lectures at Apple University and really trying to help preserve some of the legacy of Steve Jobs and how they approach product development, how they think about things a little bit differently. So one of the lectures that he was nice enough to share with me was a lecture on sort of the design decisions of Frederick Law Olmsted when he was designing Central Park in New York City. And at the time, Central Park was this sort of oasis of trees and vegetation in the heart of this urban area. And at the time, only the very wealthy people had the chance to escape the city and go up to the Hudson River Valley and sort of get away from the bustle of the city. And so he really wanted to give the common people an appreciation for the outdoors. And so the way he did that from a design standpoint was to have curved paths through the park. And so that every walk along a path would be discovery. You would never be able to see all the way ahead because the path was curved. And so you would constantly be walking and rediscovering new things about nature. And so it was a very small, poignant example of a design element that comes from the park services, right? It comes from Frederick Law Olmsted and architecture and landscape design, and applying that to Apple. And you think of this is not the thing that you would expect to hear at a lecture at Apple, yet this is the kind of thinking that really sort of breaks the mold and makes people quote unquote think different. Right?
Interesting. And see, there is this entire narrative around technology kind of taking away all the jobs from humans, right from manufacturing jobs to start with robots taking over, and then there is this entire thing around with the AlphaGo, there are these applications which are today being hired as lawyers who are able to the artificial intelligence which is able to increase the amount of savings that people have from parking tickets and other petty crimes. And then there is this entire theme around artificial intelligence creating images, creating art, drawing landscapes by learning from the old masters, and this entire thing around artificial intelligence able to write lyrics. I've even seen a movie which was conceptualized, written, scripted, and directed by artificial intelligence. I mean, this is the narrative that seems to be occupying the public consciousness. There is no parallel or there is no contradicting narrative at all, which is a little surprising as well as which is a little alarming for me. So what do you think is the reason for this? Is it just because it's sexy, it's new, and that's why it's more commonly spoken about? And where do you see this happening and where do you see this going?
It's a great question. I mean, you're right. You can't open your laptop without seeing, can't pick up your phone without seeing 15 headlines about AI taking over this or that. I was listening to a panel last week with multiple people from computer science departments across America. And, it's obviously part of the public mind share. And I don't know, it's interesting from the venture lens. 5 years ago, we heard the term big data all the time. Every company, regardless of which industry it was applying technology to, was becoming a big data company, in quotes, And we kind of joked about it internally if, just put big data on the slides and suddenly you'll raise venture capital. And I think that's certainly become artificial intelligence. So I think there is, for many companies, there's a conflation of modern programming techniques that have been around for a number of years, you know, and sort of stacking these together in different ways. And suddenly now we have a term for that, and we call it artificial intelligence. And really, that runs a whole spectrum of things from AlphaGo, which truly is stacking some of these deep learning techniques and adversarial neural networks and using training data, but then also being able to sort of extrapolate data, without sort of humans in the room. And there are elements of pushing this genre forward in very significant ways. But I think we also conflate a lot of the technologies as always being that. And so, really, there's a whole gamut of types of technologies out there. And I think, this sort of the leading edge certainly has some of these capabilities, but then there are a lot of people that are riding on the coattails of this to raise capital and promote their business and all that. So I think we need to take some of it with a grain of salt. That said, obviously the changes are significant for employment and for those aspects of society. And so I do think the conversations about changes in unemployment or technological unemployment or the need for potential basic income, things like that. I really think those are necessary parts of the conversation we should be having, because as these technologies gain capability and as the capability does, wedge its way deeper and deeper into our world, we have to be thinking about those things. But at the same time, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago with Oxford University where they looked at U.S. Jobs, and they said, by the year 2025, 47% of all U.S. employment will be at high risk of automation. And this sort of set off alarm bells. And in January this year, McKinsey Global Institute, the consulting firm and sort of the think tank within the consulting firm, came out with a study that looked at tasks within jobs. And so they took jobs and they said, well, every job is not the same. Jobs have many different types of tasks within them. And let's take a look at the technologies that are out there, what the capability sets of those technologies are, and then let's match that with some of the tasks that make up these these jobs. And let's see sort of technologically what's capable of being automated, and then let's think about what's the timeline of actual labor and capital substitution. These will take management decisions. These will require board meetings. These will require investment. Obviously, if you have a robot that can make hamburgers, that's great, but the robot's not also going to take out the trash and greet the customer and do many other things. So then you have to look at the substitution effect of, you could substitute capital for labor in some contexts, but not all contexts. And so what the timeline is for this, nobody knows. McKinsey estimated between 8 and 28 years. What they also estimated was that within 60% of jobs, 30% of the tasks were things that could be substituted away and technologically capable of being substituted away with current technology. So, I think when we take a step back and it goes back to the kind of core thesis of the book and, making the liberal arts sort of front and center again in how we think about the world, I think we've adopted this sort of Twitter mentality of reading the headline, reading the 140 characters, and then saying, okay, I get it, I know the answer. And in many of these articles, when I actually read down to the 10th paragraph in the piece in the Atlantic or the piece in sort of a long form journal where they really explore sort of the nuances of these questions, you'll often find that Manuela Veloso from Carnegie Mellon's machine learning department, you get down to not the headline, but you get down to paragraph 10 and they say, well, we've really got a long way to go. And actually over time, it's more about the intertwining of humanity and AI. And it's about sort of the usefulness of either of these is sort of with respect to the other. And so obviously there are things like crunching numbers, running analyses of data, which machines will do infinitely better than humans. They're processing at the speed of light. We're processing at the speed of biochemistry and all that. And, but there are other things where we say, okay, well, who's asking questions of how the data was curated? Like, who's asking questions of what potential bias in the data might be? How do we frame the data? Where did the answer come from? One of the things with neural nets and some of this new technology is maybe they can get the right answer, but if we don't have an explanation for how they got to that right answer, in some contexts, that won't be sufficient. And so in some contexts where there's, say, legal liability or something like that, companies may or may not be able to substitute technology for labor, but at some point, they might not be willing to do that because of the ability to explain that to customers, the ability to explain that to somebody. So I think there are a lot of nuances behind the headlines, and I think getting back to the sort of liberal arts sort of inquiry into who we are and what we want out of the world and these sorts of questions. These are really the kind of incumbent questions we should be asking of the AI revolution as well.
Yeah, and I also think this explains a lot of confusion or a lot of indecisiveness that I see in a lot of these tech companies or organizations which want to leverage some of these technologies. For example, in my current role, I know that there are a lot of organizations that are looking at exploring how can they leverage IoT in their businesses, how can they leverage big data in their businesses, and every time they come up short on the right use cases, which is where the fuzziness or the ability to understand humanity and how machines, humans, and human-to-human interaction, human-to-machine interaction can work, can actually play a big role in identifying what those potential use cases are, where some of these technologies can be applied. I mean, the technology is there, but I think the understanding of where the technology can be applied and in a way that augments the human capabilities as well is something that is still missing in a lot of places.
Yeah, I think it's really important to sort of to kind of address that, because if you look at for example, there's one company that I talk about in the book, and it's a company called Stitch Fix. And Stitch Fix is it's an algorithmic fashion company. So what they do is, if you've heard of or used Netflix, Netflix obviously provides movies. They algorithmically determine based on characteristics of movies that you've liked before. They extrapolate that out. They obviously can't ask you if you like every movie, but they take a subset of the movies that you have liked. They look at the parameters around that, and they characterize where you may or may not like movies in the future. And similarly, Stitch Fix does this with fashion. So they send you 5 items of clothing in a box, and you keep 3 of the items and you send 2 of them back. And on each item of clothing, they have 100 to 150 characteristics of that clothing tracked. So they say, okay, this has a button-down collar, it has a certain width lapel, and these different features. This may be a fashion-forward shirt, which means Mukesh has a very fashion-forward sense of style and less classic or less hipster, and they classify you a certain way. But what's really fascinating about Stitch Fix is they've gone from 0 to $500 million in revenue in about 5 years. The founder, Katrina Lake, she's not deeply technical. She was technical enough to be able to explain her product and hire people around her. She studied economics and business. But she was able to convince a guy named Eric Colson, who ran data science and algorithms for Netflix, to leave his high-paying senior level position at Netflix to join her in this startup. And what they did was basically pair human and machine. So they say that they have both their machine algorithm, which is their M algorithm, and they have their human algorithm, which is their H algorithm. And what they mean by this is, they use 60 plus data scientists, PhDs, machine learning people to really look at the characteristics in the clothing and be able to create a list. So when we send a box to Mukesh, we know that, okay, here are 10 items of clothing that we think you may like. But then what happens is, rather than just sending those 10 items to you directly, those 10 items go to a stylist who is a human-to-human interface between the technology layer of Stitch Fix and Mukesh as a person. And they might know, okay, you're based in a certain city in India, you're based in Bangalore, or you have this set of preferences, you're part of this demographic group. And so they start peeling back the onion on sort of what types of preferences you might have within that subset of the 10 items of clothing, and they do the last mile delivery of those final 5. And what they found is that people have inherent biases, and so they can actually use their M algorithm to de-bias the human. But the human is essential to sort of provide that last mile delivery. And so if you look at the composition of the company, it's 3,000 or 4,000 human stylists, and it's 60 or so data scientists. And and I think that has ramifications for what we'll see, in general, I think in other companies, where there'll be massive elements of data science and elements of algorithmic determination of certain things. Those will be, helped and managed by a set of very technical data scientists. And then you'll have this whole other set of human-to-human interface people. And so I think we'll see this sort of duality of the same way that Stitch Fix has the fuzzy and the techie, or the human and the machine algorithm.
Interesting. And why do you think it is important to? Okay, let me rephrase this question. So you spoke about the M algorithm and the H algorithm that Stitch Fix uses in order to be able to deliver the right kind of, or the 5 pieces of clothing to the customer, and looks like it's getting a lot of traction because of this. Because I mean, of course, they are growing, so which means that people do like what they are recommending and are buying from those set of clothes that they get. But don't you think this is actually restricting your choices? I know that you talk about that in your book as well, as to how all of these recommendation engines are actually creating kind of an echo chamber within which we are all living, and that kind of leads away to the deep sense of how do I put it? The entire world seems to be divided, and there seems to be no middle ground where both sides of the world can actually come together, talk to each other, and maybe exchange views, and maybe potentially are able to switch sides at some point in time, which seems to be a big concern, not just in the technology world but also in the political world. I see that happening across the world, whether it is the US, whether it is Europe, whether it is India or China. So
yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that, and how is it that we can actually avoid something like this getting more intensified?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, looking at Facebook, for example, early on, I know that photo tagging, so tagging people's pictures with names, was something that led to massive virality within the Facebook product. So, early on, you could only have one profile picture, and then they noticed in the user behavior. So it goes back to sort of the fuzzy anthropological kind of side of things. But through observing user behavior, what they realized at early Facebook was that people were basically they were stumbling from page to page to page just to look at people's profile pictures, if they had changed or not. And so they realized that the user behavior behind how people were browsing Facebook was actually looking at photos. And so photos became the centerpiece, and they launched photos as a product. And then photo tagging was introduced as well. And that was something that I don't know if you were on the platform in 2004, 2005, but the photo tagging, when you'd get an email and you would say you were tagged in a photo, that was a big deal, and that drew you back into the platform, created that sort of viral hook. One of the early features that I thought was amazing was photo tagging, because it mitigated this notion of homophily, or kind of birds of a feather flock together. So homophily is kind of love of the same, and I think we all have this problem where we tend to have friends that are a little bit like us. We have people that, if you're a doctor in Mumbai, chances are you hang out with other doctors in Mumbai. And that's not a failure of any one of us, but that's just sort of human nature of how we kind of come together and share things. And I think one of the brilliant things of photo tagging was early on, it actually pushed you to this sort of frontier of seeing because you would be tagged in a photo, and then maybe others would be tagged in the photo, and you could very quickly stumble your way into a world. I lived in India for a year, and I had a number of friends from India and Pakistan and all over different parts of the world. And within 2 or 3 clicks, I would find myself at a wedding party, up in Punjab or something, and I would be looking at all these photos, and I would say, wow, this is a part of the world that I hadn't been exposed to before. And it actually opened up my eyes, and it led me to take trips there and to experience that world. And so for me, that was something that really broke down the barriers, that sort of algorithmically determined barriers of how I was kind of corralled through Facebook. So early on, I think that was something that was really powerful to kind of mitigate homophily, or to give people a wider aperture to different parts of the world. I think, with the rise of newsfeed, we've almost seen a closing down of that in some ways, where now, if you're here in the United States, there's a joke about there being a red feed and a blue feed, because if you have a bunch of Republican friends, chances are you see red feed, you see a lot of Republican proponents posting things that are pro-Trump or anti-Obama, and vice versa. And so I do think that we've got to sort of take a step back and realize that people are spending an inordinate amount of time interfacing with the world through these lenses, through these technological lenses. And there's somebody that that I talk about in the book who is doing a good job of raising awareness around this concept. But a guy named Tristan Harris, he founded a company called Apture back in 2007. He sold that company to Google, and then he became Google's in-house product philosopher. And this is sort of an invented title that he said, I'm going to be the product philosopher. But then he owned up to it, and he started doing analyses on how very few product managers sitting mostly in Mountain View, California, were making decisions that were having ramifications for billions of users around the planet. And sort of taking a step back and saying, wait a minute, who should be in the room? How should we be thinking about some of these product decisions? Because the opportunity cost of taking someone's attention, taking somebody in and having them spend 30 more seconds in our app is actually 30 seconds that person is no longer doing what they would otherwise be doing in the physical analog world. So we need to be conscious and have this sort of mentality about time well spent, which is the name of his movement. And I think that more people are starting to pay attention to this notion. As we have computers on our desktops and computers in our pockets in the form of smartphones. Steve Jobs had this quote many years ago where he said he wanted the personal computer to be a bicycle for the mind. And Tristan has a phrase where he calls the slot machine, the cell phone, a slot machine in our pocket. And you kind of look at this disconnect between what Steve Jobs' vision for the iPhone probably was and what it's kind of become in our pockets. And how do we remain conscious of this? Who should be in the room asking some of these questions? Should there be any sort of oversight in the same way that we often show calorie counts in restaurants where people may be conscious of their health, and people can still make whatever decision they choose about what they choose to eat, whether it's veg or non-veg or this or that. But they at least have sort of the information, the full set of information when they make that decision. And so those are questions that I think we should definitely be asking.
So and given or in addition to what is happening in the tech world, there is all this entire movement of behavioral psychology and the entire movement probably led by BJ Fogg and people like him who are using technology to build habits amongst humans. I mean, of course, BJ Fogg also talks about the ethics of using some of these technologies. So does Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler in their book Nudge. But ultimately, I think it all boils down to every entrepreneur, every product manager who is building a product using persuasive technology to decide the cost of having that attention from the user. And Google can today. I can say that Google can afford to think of those terms, but I'm not so sure that some of the startups that are still trying to gain momentum are thinking in those terms at all. I mean, all they want is as much attention as possible so that they can raise money. So it's a very delicate situation that we are in right now.
And I think you're totally right about that. Google has in some ways the responsibility and the luxury of having to think about these things. But you're right. If you're a seed-backed, Series A-backed startup and you're trying to grow, you got to have that graph up and to the right, and you've got limited runway based on the capital that you've raised, and you've got to prove that there's high engagement. That's the term that we love to use. It's very true, and I think one sort of taking a step back that engagement is not necessarily a bad thing, and attention is not necessarily a bad thing either. And so using some of the behavioral characteristics to nudge behavior one way or the other, these are sort of normative, neutral statements. So it can be good, it can be used for harm, it can be used for good. And I think, in the book, I also talk about a number of examples where these are used in really positive ways. So in the United States, there's a real epidemic of diabetes. And diabetes a lot of times has to do with diet. It has to do with the amount of exercise that you get. And so there's one entrepreneur who I talked about named Sean Duffy, who spent time at IDEO, the design firm, and did medical work before that. And really sort of blended, he's a perfect blend of this sort of fuzzy and techie, because Sean wasn't deeply technical in the sense of writing all the code for his company, which is called Omada Health. but he did understand some of the medicine and the science, and then he also understood some of the behavioral aspects. And what he's doing is using sort of the smartphone to engage people to get off the couch, engage people to sort of target their weight loss. That they may have these goals where, you know, they've been told you have pre-diabetic condition where if you don't start exercising more and you don't change your diet, you're going to get diabetes, and that's going to have a big impact on your lifestyle. But, you know, in sort of the current universe, either the intervention programs are extremely invasive and extremely expensive, where they involve human-to-human contact, or it's a flyer, a pamphlet, or a piece of paper where it says, "Take this home, change your habits, good luck." And most people can't change that way. And so what Omada does is it uses these nudges on your phone to sort of get you out of the house, to get you moving. They have a connected scale where you have a small group of people and you weigh in and people share their progress. And there's this whole social element to it. And so they've actually found that 8% of people in the U.S. have type 2 diabetes, where they have this precondition to get diabetes. They found that, you know, with 7% of your by losing 7% of your body mass, you had a 58% reduction in getting diabetes. So they know that if you lose weight, it really helps stop this. And what they found with Omada is that by having these sort of behavioral nudges baked into the cell phone, baked into the scale, baked into the community that they work with, they've had 80% of people who go through the program actually lose this 7% of their body weight, and then have this 58% reduction in the chance of getting diabetes. So I think it's a great example of, you know, changing habits, nudging people one way or the other. Can certainly lead us to scroll Instagram for hours and hours and hours, and it can also lead us to, you know, get out of the house and change our habits and stop ourselves from, you know, having this condition down the road. So I think that, you know, we can look at it both ways.
Yeah, I think it all boils down to how we use technology for ourselves. I think the most human touch of all. So let's shift gears a little bit. Now that you've written this great book, and my audience is entrepreneurs who are seeing already some success. So based on what you have seen while writing this book, what do you think the entrepreneurs should be thinking about or should be doing in order to, you know, take their business to the next level? Are there any, 1, 2, 3 things that you think they should definitely look at?
You know, one of the interesting things that I experienced through the process of writing the book was the parallels that it has to the startup world. And so, having spent years in venture capital and meeting with all these entrepreneurs, and then before that at Google and briefly at Facebook, I've been part of this entrepreneurial community for a long time. And but I haven't yet started sort of my own full platform of a startup. And so I was remiss in that sense. And so the book has really become that for me. And in many ways, I would say that recognize that nobody can have the conviction about your subject or your idea more than you, and nobody's going to help you get to the next level as much as you. And so it's that conviction of really sort of being the advocate for whatever you believe, and then allowing other people to come into the fold and help you get there. But I found with the book that, you know, it wouldn't have happened had I waited around for other people to sort of pat me on the back and say, I believe what you're saying is true. Or, you know, most people early on, they say that's a crazy idea, or that's been done before, or, you know, why are you going to waste all your time doing that? It's a really low return on time, or so everyone has an opinion, right? And I would say that one of the things I used to say in venture capital was, you don't need everyone to like you, but you need someone to love you. And I think that goes for books, that goes for startups, that goes for a lot of things. And so, you know, continue to have that conviction in whatever you believe. And then, you know, the other is I think we're moving to this sort of application layer of technology where, you know, the infrastructure has been laid down in different ways. And a lot of these tools have become really democratized. So you look at machine learning now, TensorFlow is basically open source, with Arduinos and Raspberry Pis. And I mean, there's an incredible suite of tools out there. Not to mention the General Assemblies and the Codecademies and the Treehouses and all the different platforms online and offline to continue to upskill And so I would say don't rest on your laurels. You may have studied computer science as an undergrad. You may have studied commerce or whatever it may be. But really, the proxies for evaluation of your skills are getting closer and closer tied to what you know today. And so it's really incumbent upon all of us to continue to learn as we go through our worlds. And Matt Breimer, who founded General Assembly and is based in New York, he's actually a sociology major from Yale. And so he was not a technical guy, but he founded this urban community college for creating technical literacy. And I think it's such a great sort of ironic story that people would say, well, how did this sociology major create this this tech platform? But Matt was brilliant in the sense that he recognized the value of community. He recognized the value of keeping your education, quote unquote, in beta, always sort of being a work in progress. And that, going to a community college in the United States, at least, was often seen to be sort of, you live in the suburbs and maybe you take a class at night. And he sort of reinvented this idea and brought it right into the urban center and said, no, this is something that whether you're a highly successful person working at an investment bank or in consulting or whatever it might be, you still may want to learn some of these new skills. You still want to take a JavaScript class at night, or you want to, learn Ruby on Rails, or you want to just understand the basics of machine learning. And so those are things that I think we have to continually reinvest in ourselves.
True. And I think if I have to kind of, put it in my own words based on whatever you just said, and my understanding is that, if you are already a techie, continue to upgrade your skills from a technology perspective, but at the same time, don't leave the human element or the human touch for sure. And if you are a fuzzy, who understands how humans behave, please continue to invest in understanding some of these technological layers. In your book, you really very, very well explain the entire concept of democratization of technology, and how the different elements that are required from a technology perspective are already there, and all you need to do is probably be able to understand them well enough to be able to stitch them together and create something interesting along with your human interactions.
Yeah, there's a great line about being not a full stack developer, but becoming a full stack integrator. And I think that the sort of modular building blocks are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and so you don't have to sort of code on the metal anymore. Now we're abstracting layer and layer away. And if you look at some of the tools today, there's a company out of Holland called Framer. And Framer allows you to build real-time prototypes by either manipulating sketch files. Sketch is sort of the new version of Photoshop. It's online. It's also, I believe, a Dutch company. And so using Sketch or manipulating the code, you can actually manipulate either side and the other changes. And it's fascinating. You have basically a developer environment to create a prototype, but somebody with no sort of technical ability can manipulate the visual imagery, and that changes the code. And then somebody with a technical mind can manipulate the code, and that changes the visual imagery. And so I think we're getting more to a place where this is possible from both sides.
And I think what really is or can potentially be the differentiating factor as we go along this trajectory is human imagination and ingenuity. I think whether you are a techie or whether you are a fuzzy, what will matter most is your ability to imagine a future where you are able to solve a particular kind of a problem and go after that future is what actually will pave the way for success. I mean, at least that's my understanding.
Yeah, so Marc Andreessen, who's obviously the creator of Netscape, the browser, and then one of the founders of Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm, Andreessen said a couple years back, how software was eating the world, and I think to kind of flip that around, software is feeding the world. Software is actually being applied to all these different domains where it's incumbent upon us coming from different backgrounds, from different understandings, to be able to apply this technology meaningfully. So, if you come out of various walks of life where you really understand agriculture, or you really understand construction and urbanization, or you really understand manufacturing processes. These are the worlds that are ripe for example, for the Internet of Things to come into a manufacturing context, or for sensors to come into an urban context for making buildings run more efficiently, or for energy consumption, things like that. So these require people coming from these walks of life and then partnering with a technologist maybe to build some of the tools, or using some of these platforms to upskill on their own enough to build a prototype, to raise capital, to then hire the team around them. But exactly as you say, as software feeds the world, we really need more people from different backgrounds to come in and apply the technology meaningfully.
Yeah. So I think we are kind of nearing the end of the time that we've got. So maybe, we'll shift gears again and get into a rapid fire kind of a mode.
Yeah.
So if you were to thank someone publicly outside of your parents, who would that be and why?
Well, I think so. I didn't grow up playing cricket, but I've been to my fair share of ODIs and Cricket World Cup. But I did grow up playing football, European style, not American style. And one person I would definitely thank would be my soccer coach during my sort of high school years. My coach, he was one of these guys that made us, wake up at 7, 8 in the morning on a Saturday, and whether it was raining or muddy or whatever, we were always out in the fields, we were running. And one of the lines that he would say is, he would name one of our rivals, and he would say, "Those guys are sleeping right now. Those guys, they went out too late last night. They're hungover. They're still in bed. And the only time that you're getting better is when they're asleep and you're working." And so I think it was this mentality of sort of put in the time, and more than that, I still think I have that mentality where it'll be snowing in New York or raining in New York or something like that, and I feel more inclined to go for a run or go do something like that because I know that everybody else is sitting at home on the couch.
Interesting. So again, so if you have to apologize to someone publicly, who would that be and why?
Well, that'd probably would be my girlfriend for spending too much time writing this book.
Okay. So you've also run Iron Mountain 70.3. So what have you learned having done that twice, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, so I've done a few marathon events, and like you said, I did one Ironman 70.3, which it requires about 2 kilometer swim, about 90 kilometer bike, and then about a 20 kilometer run at the end. And really, I mean, that I did it in Mexico, and it was about 35 or 40 degrees Celsius. It was terribly hot. And toward the end of the race, it really sort of tested my own willpower and ability to finish the race. And I actually ended up finishing, but I ended up finishing literally over the line and then just collapsing when I crossed the line. And I had to get an IV, for fluids into my arm and the whole 9 yards. And it was really kind of testing my own physical limits. And so I think when you do something like that, it really helps you realize that your day-to-day problems aren't so big, and if you have to stay up late to get something done or whatever, you can definitely do it.
Interesting. So the next question is, every one of us needs to continuously learn and stay relevant. We spoke about that a little while earlier as well. So how do you continue to learn and stay relevant in an ever-changing world?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with the book is, I think you have to consume information and then you have to produce information. And so, or hopefully produce knowledge, take information in and then convert it into something that's meaningful and convert it to knowledge. And I think for me, I use a tool called Pocket, which I really enjoy, where I feel like people send me articles a lot, and I'm constantly seeing things on Twitter or different online platforms, and to be able to save them all to Pocket, have an offline set of PDFs that I could look at on my phone or look at while I was on the move, that was really helpful to me. So being able to track information and tag it and put it into different categories. So if I could basically save all articles on artificial intelligence to one folder or something like that, and then I could read it later. I also find that I'm reading a fiction book right now for the first time in a while, because I've been sort of in this nonfiction process of consuming information to then tie into my own book. And the process of going back to fiction has been really wonderful. And I've realized as well that, the fiction writing, it just has so much more color and nuance and empathy and flavor of experiencing a different world. So right now I'm reading a book called The North Water, and it's about a whaling ship out of the Shetland Islands in northern Scotland that takes place in the 1850s. And you just feel completely immersed in that world. And I was reading it last night, and I still feel kind of completely immersed in that world and the characters. And I think that there's something about that experience as well, to kind of get out of the rut of, we could read, there's diminishing returns, right? Once you've read 50 articles on machine learning and AI, at some point, to have something truly be accretive to how you see the world, maybe you need to take a step back and do something totally different. Go for a run or read a book of fiction or something like that kind of opens your eyes in a different way.
Okay, so the show is called Pushing Beyond the Obvious. So what is so obvious to you that people all the time miss?
Well, I think my answer to that is easy, and it's my book. Because basically, coming out of Silicon Valley and sitting on Sand Hill, there really was this narrative that if you study STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, you have the golden ticket to future relevance. And I think as technology becomes more democratized and as these tools become more available, it's actually these human skills that become increasingly relevant as well. Not to discount technology, not to discount technical literacy. Those are very important things. But I think reinvesting in these human aspects, because if you think about where AI and machine learning go, they start to take away the rote aspects of our jobs. They start to take away the things that are very straightforward and scripted and have best practices. And the things that then remain are the things that are more complex, where we have to trade tasks between the two of us. And as we trade tasks, those require collaboration, those require communication, those require understanding your perspective and mine, empathy. And those are things that are hard to teach. Those are things that you can't just take an online class for 30 minutes and suddenly learn. So in many ways, I think the ability to, go online and learn Ruby on Rails is perhaps easier than the time investment it takes to really understand another human from another background, which may or may not require, years of conversations, years of sort of debates and literature and art and things like that. And so I think it's just not to forget those two sides. And so the counterintuitive truth that I think is out there that people haven't yet recognized is that the investment in education in things that are non-explicitly vocational, that are not directly related to the job that you get tomorrow, those actually have a lot of value. And those are the things that may or may not become more relevant, as we move forward in 10 or 20 years.
Interesting. So the book is called The Fuzzy and the Techie. And the book is coming out when, Scott?
Comes out April 25th, so next Tuesday.
So next Tuesday. So please go ahead and buy the book, read it. If nothing else, I think it will give you a lot of different perspectives to look at how technology is moving and where we are moving. And at best, you will understand the importance of having someone who understands human behavior, human psychology, and comes from a different perspective, and the importance that those perspectives bring in when it comes to building and creating great products. So Scott, where can people connect with you online?
So the easiest place, I'm at Twitter. I'm Scott E. Hartley on Twitter, and the book, the URL is just fuzzytechie.com. And it's on Amazon and a number of other bookstores across the web. But yeah, please reach out over Twitter, facebook.com/fuzzytechie as well. And I'm pretty available online, so I'm happy to answer questions or engage with people. You know where to find me.
Super. Thanks a lot for taking time and talking to us, Scott. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mukesh.